Testing, 1, 2, 3, 4. Testing, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Oh, no, no, no. Just click.
Click. One, two, three. Yeah.
Again?
One, two, three.
Again?
One, two, three.
want me on the far side or your side? Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us this afternoon at the International Institute for Strategic Studies US, the Washington home of the IISS. My name is Sam Charup. I'm the Senior Fellow for Russia and Eurasia at the IISS. For those of you who don't know us that well, we are a global think tank with a total of 4 offices, including our mothership in London, but also here in DC and in Bahrain and Singapore. And I'm very pleased to introduce one of my London-based colleagues to you today. Ben Barry is the IISS Senior Fellow for Land Warfare. He joined the IISS after a distinguished career in the British Army, leaving the Army in October 2010. He commanded troops at every rank from lieutenant to brigadier and in every British infantry role apart from parachute, which is a real shortcoming, I guess. And, we'll have to talk about that later, Ben. He served in Northern Ireland and divided Germany during the Cold War, and France, Portugal, Canada, and Hong Kong, as well as commanding a NATO brigade in Bosnia. His final appointment in the British Army was leading its analysis of lessons learned from the Iraq campaign. He's here today to speak to us about 2 unforeseen wars, a military analysis of the conflict in Ukraine and the campaign against ISIS. Ben will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So please, Ben.
Okay, both wars came as strategic shocks to the US, its allies, and to NATO. And they're also often described as hybrid wars. What I'm going to do is look at each conflict separately. First, a brief history from a military point of view, and then some key emerging military assessments of both conflicts. And finally, I'm going to put together what both wars tell us about contemporary conflict in general and so-called hybrid wars in particular. Can you hear me all right at the back? And you'll have to forgive me because I had a British cold over the weekend, which Washington, D.C. has proved the best antidote, but it still hasn't quite gone. Okay, starting with Ukraine. The sophisticated Russian operation to take over Crimea was led by Russian Spetsnaz, their SOF, and elite airborne and naval infantry, and there was also propaganda, information warfare, and maskirovka, which translates best as deception. What we saw during the operation was new infantry equipment, some of which you can see being worn by those 2 soldiers, new communications, new Tigger light armoured vehicles, and the tactics showed integrated use of special forces, rapid mobility, electronic warfare, coupled with deniability and deception. So there was a multifaceted and pretty successful information campaign, which was targeted both at domestic Russian audiences, at Ukrainian audiences, and also foreign audiences, and one in which continued denials and rebuttals from Moscow that it wasn't militarily involved, even if they became increasingly implausible, created a sense of cognitive dissonance in foreign decision makers. And the concurrent rapid mobilization of troops from the western and southern military districts, which brought about 40,000 Russian troops to assembly areas close to the Ukrainian border, which proceeded very smoothly, also reinforced the cognitive dissonance. But the campaign in the Crimea was notable in that both sides actively sought to avoid the use of lethal force. Now, Russia may have been aided in this by intelligence agencies' penetration of the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian state. But this relative lack of use of force by the Russian military and its observance of what looked to be highly restrictive rules of engagement shows us that this was a military better trained and led than it had been in Afghanistan in the 1980s or Chechnya subsequently. And the apparently rapid formulation of an imaginative concept of operations and a plan, apparently devised at relatively short notice, confirmed my strong suspicion that Russia retains the capability it forged from 1942 onwards of having a cadre of competent strategic and operational level planners, as well as an aptitude for deception. Although much of Russian combat capability was not tested in combat, the standing and morale of Russian armed forces would have been improved by the Crimea operation. Then, of course, we've had an insurgency by pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine? And why hasn't the Ukrainian government been able to suppress the insurgency? Well, firstly, it's my judgment that to a certain extent the separatists have exploited legitimate grievances held by the people of eastern Ukraine, not least those arising from corruption and economic mismanagement. And secondly, a combination of underinvestment in the Ukrainian armed forces and a degree of corruption and nepotism. 25 years ago, the Russian and Ukrainian forces were both part of the same force, the Red Army. But since the two countries split, Ukraine has consistently underinvested in defence, and corruption has further weakened the Ukrainian security sector. Now, if we subsequently look at the fighting in eastern Ukraine, Ukraine's military appears to have made little effort to conduct counterinsurgency, at least counterinsurgency as the US Army and US Marines would understand it from their experience of the last 15 years. And both sides in this war have made widespread use of artillery, rockets and shelling amidst operations amongst civilian population centres. Now, last summer, around sort of July, August, the Ukrainian government forces were achieving some success in pushing the separatists back, but they were stopped in their tracks by Russian intervention, particularly by professionally applied indirect fire. And what is left of the Ukrainian Air Force has been neutralised by a layered air defence of separatist territory. And this is a picture of some separatist artillery firing in Ukraine. Since the defeat of the Ukrainian government counter-offensive, Ukrainian government forces have largely lost information superiority. For example, drones working on behalf of the separatists and signals intelligence trigger mortar, artillery and rocket attacks, or heavy jamming, or some unpleasant combination of all four, on Ukrainian forces close to the front line, especially headquarters. And when this has been combined with tank and infantry attacks, supported by artillerymen who know their business, separatist combined arms attacks have overwhelmed defending government troops. So what we've seen are classic Soviet-style combined arms tactics, reflecting the shared military heritage of both parties to the war, also reflecting the increasingly bitter nature of the combat. And we shouldn't forget that civilian suffering on both sides in Ukraine has been profound. I think this fighting tells us something about Russian capability. It's difficult to tell how much of the military effects achieved by the separatists are achieved by them on their own, or separatists with Russian training, or volunteer units, or advice and assistance by Russian individuals, subunits or units. And to a certain extent, that's irrelevant to my emerging observations. Now, this slide here actually relates to some other points I'm going to make. This is a government MTLB, armoured personnel carrier, that's been subject to bombardment. You can tell that because it's covered with earth and rocks. And the anti-aircraft gun that was mounted on top of it has clearly been destroyed. And it's quite clear from multiple media reporting that the separatist artillery know their business. And also it's quite clear that the Russian artillery that intervened across the border last year know their business. And not just on their own, but as part of combined arms battle. And they've also got long-range rockets for depth battle. They're able to use intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance assets, drones, signals intelligence, to cue effective strikes. They're able to create a layered air defence, albeit against a relatively unmodernised Ukrainian Air Force. Russia itself is able to move battalions and brigades efficiently and quickly by rail, with no apparent disruption to the Russian civil rail services, evidence that the 4 railway brigades that remains in the Russian army know their stuff. I think there's evidence on the other side, though, that the Russian government are very sensitive about casualties and their impact on friends and families. So the strategic decision taken in 2008 to embark on a comprehensive modernisation programme of Russian military capability, as well as increasing defence expenditure, has in the eyes of the Russian leadership and Russian people been validated. And I think the operations and the repeated snap mobilisations demonstrate that various, the measures to improve readiness have certainly taken fruit. It will be very interesting to see what lessons they take away from these operations and what adjustments they make. And they certainly have implications for NATO military planners. I'm going to talk a bit more about ISIS, not because it's more important, but because in some respects it's more complicated. After the 2010 Iraqi elections, the second government of Prime Minister Maliki saw him greatly consolidate his power. And this included marginalising and persecuting key Sunni and Kurd politicians, and a toxic combination of discrimination, deliberate neglect, and increasingly heavy-handed repression of an increasingly disenfranchised Sunni minority. And of course, while this was going on, the remnants of al-Qaeda in Iraq took up arms against the Assad regime in Syria. Rebranding itself as ISIS, it carved out territory from the central town of Raqqa to the Iraqi border. And as well as imposing its brutal version of Sharia, it sought to achieve a measure of stability in the towns it controlled, generating revenue, raising taxes, kidnappings and black market trading of oil and looted antiquities, for example. But in parallel with this, it rebuilt its networks in the increasingly discontented Sunni communities in Iraq. And as documented in its 2 annual reports, it mounted bombings, assassinations and guerrilla warfare against Iraqi security forces. And it also developed sophisticated propaganda, including well-edited videos on YouTube and a highly effective Twitter operation to garner international jihadist volunteers, financial donations and support from Syrian and Iraqi Sunnis. It's not so long ago, a bit over a year, that it mounted its decisive offensive in Iraq. It seized Fallujah, from which it wasn't dislodged. Over the following months, it gained an increasing advantage over the Iraqi government forces around Mosul. And Iraqi senior commanders' precipitate self-evacuation from Mosul seems to have triggered a widespread rout, resulting in the disintegration of the best part of 3 or 4 Iraqi divisions. Now, how did this happen? Well, again, corruption, nepotism and cronyism ate military capability. From 2010 to 2014, Maliki centralised control of security, directly assuming military authority for the armed forces, police and intelligence services. Tried and tested police and army commanders, who'd proven their effectiveness in the previous decade, were replaced by less capable but politically loyal proxies. So despite possessing large amounts of US military hardware, endemic corruption reduced the effectiveness of the army and police. And the many media reports, both in the Iraqi media and foreign media, in mid-2014 of Iraqi army units with inadequate rations, water, ammunition and vehicles, suggest that vast amounts of money and materiel had been stolen by corrupt officers and officials, with obvious reduction of military capability and corrosive effect on morale and fighting spirit. Now, I think that has been well covered in the US media, but you might find it interesting to share my analysis of ISIS's operations and tactics. Throughout 2014, the Iraqi state was attacked in 3 different ways. Firstly, by a classic insurgency, which was significant around Mosul. There also were ISIS insurgencies in Sunnite communities in and around Baghdad, as well as Diyala province. And I should say that there are 6 or 7 other Sunni insurgent groups that have aligned themselves with ISIS as well. And of course, this complicated the calculations of the Iraqi security forces. And secondly, it used terrorist tactics to attack the government, institutions and Shia community. And this was propaganda of the deed, which acted to reinforce the image ISIS wanted to portray. And the attacks fed the fires of antagonism between Sunni and Shia, furthering ISIS's narrative of apocalyptic conflict and increasing the chances of Shia reprisals against Sunnis. Thirdly, ISIS used conventional forces to push back Iraqi government and Peshmerga forces. And once Mosul fell, it fielded large numbers of fighters mounted in civilian vehicles and captured Iraqi army vehicles, deploying pickup trucks and 4x4s mounted with heavy weapons, so-called technicals. It's quite clear that these ISIS conventional forces actively conducted ground reconnaissance. ISIS showed an impressive ability to find not just Iraqi government positions, but also to identify gaps between the positions and manoeuvre forces around them to isolate the defenders, block supply lines, and greatly complicate government efforts to counterattack. Now, there was a high water mark in early fall 2014 and a front line established, marked on the government side by an ubiquitous berm of bulldozed earth. ISIS offensives reduced but did not cease, and although they gradually pushed back on a number of occasions, ISIS commanders were able to identify gaps or other vulnerabilities in Peshmerga or Iraqi government forces, and they counterattacked, sometimes, for example, infiltrating forces to the flanks or rear of Iraqi or Peshmerga positions. Now, these offensive operations in Iraq have been concurrent with ISIS attacks in Syria against both government forces and less extreme Syrian opposition groups. So overall last year, we saw ISIS display an ability to advance on multiple fronts, to use reconnaissance to inform its plans, and create and exploit opportunities. And I think this is the hallmark of capable military leadership and effective commanders. Now, in Iraq, over the last 9 months, ISIS has been on the strategic defensive, but it's conducted a very active defence, mounting tactical counterattacks to disrupt its opponent's plans and close dangerous gaps in its front line. And these offensives also contribute to its propaganda by showing it to be a force in being, still conquering territory, defeating government forces and killing apostates. And Ramadi is quite an interesting test case. It's actually been trying to capture it for 12 months before it fell. Several earlier attacks were beaten off by government forces and by Sunni tribes fighting on the government side. But from April 2015, we can discern elements at campaign level, coordinated ISIS offensives of wide-ranging shaping and diversionary attacks north and west of Baghdad. And of course that moment came a couple of months ago when Iraqi government forces were tactically overmatched by ISIS, both in competence and possibly motivation. And they were evicted from Ramadi, possibly evicted in some disorder, and credible reports exist that this attack took place during a sandstorm which provided cover from coalition air power. Now I think this shows that ISIS is capable not only of identifying and attacking weak points in enemy defences, but also of sequencing its attacks in space and time to distract and deceive its opponents. It also shows that after the beginning of the US-led coalition air campaign, ISIS adapted its tactics and campaign design to allow it to move and concentrate forces without their being seriously disrupted by coalition air power. ISIS also practices manoeuvre and combined arms tactics, but not quite as they're taught at Fort Leavenworth. They actively conduct ground reconnaissance, and they're also capable of isolating government positions, surrounding the defenders, blocking supply lines, and complicating government attacks to counterattack. And in both Syria and Iraq, we can see that ISIS display a combined arms playbook to attacking government positions. Now, those government positions, having been surrounded, are subject to indirect fire from mortars, rockets, and sometimes captured artillery for a day or days. Now, this serves to destroy fighting positions, weapons, and soft-skinned and lightly armoured vehicles. It also reduces the morale of the defenders, many of whom neither appear to have been trained to prepare conventional field fortifications, nor have sufficiently capable leaders to counter the resulting fear. The final stage of the attack is an assault, often from multiple directions. Heavy weapons on technicals or captured armoured vehicles provide direct fire support and have also been used to defend against counterattacks by Iraqi helicopters. The close assault usually begins with suicide bomb attacks to make breaches in the physical defences of the position. These are increasingly used en masse, anything up to 20 or 30. And recently we've seen ISIS display an armoured engineer capability, both using captured armoured vehicles filled with explosives, but also using excavators and bulldozers fitted with improvised armour to breach the berms. These, of course, are also filled with explosives. And this is one that was captured by Kurdish fighters in northern Iraq. But that's just as much an armoured engineer capability as the very fine armoured engineered tanks that the US Marine Corps used very successfully in Helmand. And finally, of course, there is a close assault by ISIS fighters, sometimes led by waves of relatively expendable foreign fighters. And the assault force invariably includes ISIS cameramen filming the destruction, carnage, and any subsequent executions to be exploited by ISIS propaganda operations. Now, I grabbed that from an ISIS video, and I've no sense that that is staged. And the fire in that 113 and armoured Humvee has come from the effects of ISIS firepower, probably indirect firepower. And of course, the fall of Ramadi played into ISIS strategy by establishing a caliphate in being that has much the appearance of a state. ISIS has seized the jihadist narrative from al-Qaeda and inspired followers. And by both defending the boundaries of the caliphate and successfully mounting counterattacks in Iraq and Syria, which are rapidly exploited by its propaganda machine, it sustains and grows its support base, which in turn inspires recruits to travel to it, or violent extremists to conduct attacks on ISIS' behalf in their own countries. And these facts on the ground have motivated other violent extremists to attempt to align themselves with ISIS, hold ground, or construct outposts of the caliphate. And we've seen this with Boko Haram in Nigeria, we've seen it in Libya. We may now be seeing it in Afghanistan. And don't forget that this all helps ISIS maintain the caliphate in Syria and Iraq, because the various members of the anti-ISIS coalition have only finite intelligence and surveillance resources, such as satellites and drones, and they've also only finite national intelligence services, the CIA or their equivalent. So these external activities by ISIS and those inspired by it reduce the ability of the anti-ISIS coalition. And it's an inconvenient truth that if the numbers of new fighters joining ISIS's frontline forces in Syria, Iraq, is equal to or greater than those being killed in combat, the caliphate stands a reasonable chance of enduring for some time. And ISIS's propaganda and operations are intertwined at every level, from the tactical to the strategic. Now, that in itself is not new. So I want to finish by just some emerging thoughts about what these two conflicts tell us more generally about both the nature of war and then about military capability. They remind us that war is a clash of wills between actors seeking to shape events to suit their political aims. The enemy has a vote and may choose to fight to the death to cast it. The combatants are seeking to gain and exploit all the advantage they can. Attrition, manoeuvre, symmetric or asymmetric military approaches have had their role in both wars. They demonstrate the enduring application of what the British General JFC Fuller called the constant tactical factor, where every improvement by one side is checked by a counter-improvement by the other. And the wars also show plenty of examples of the factors that Clausewitz identified as distinguishing war from other activities. The effects of danger, the difficulty of gaining sufficient accurate information, the summer heat in Iraq and Syria, and the winter cold in Ukraine, both of which Clausewitz would have described as exertion, and the pervasive presence of friction. What Clausewitz wouldn't have anticipated is pervasive media reporting, which in a sense accelerates in the home states the speed of change of dynamics between the army, the people, and the government. Other news channels and the internet are greatly accelerating the passage of information of various degrees of truth, falsehood, and exaggeration. It's almost as if Clausewitz has been laid on top of Hobbes, then laid on top of Machiavelli, and then laid on top of George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones, all then shredded and spun in a powerful centrifuge. And this is, what we're seeing is the interpenetration and interdependence of war and politics, and it has increased the complexity of war, creating opportunities, risks, and threats for all actors at every level. General Petraeus has been quoted in his military role as saying, "War is not a linear problem. It's a calculus, not arithmetic." And the strategic, operational, and tactical levels are often overlapping, resulting in a political dimension to tactical operations. And a good example we've just seen is the fall of Ramadi, a tactical defeat with operational, strategic, military, and political consequences, as indeed was the fall of Debaltseve in Ukraine. Now, the conflicts also tell us much about insurgency and counterinsurgency. I don't think they tell us anything new. Disadvantage, discrimination, and repression are important root causes of insurgency. And without an effective political strategy to tackle the conditions that give rise to the insurgency, an unsophisticated security crackdown will tend to exacerbate the problem, helping the insurgents rather than suppressing them. And if the insurgents are more effective at insurgency than the government is at counterinsurgency, the balance of advantage will lie with the insurgents. Now, some commentators have seen the creation of the caliphate as a pseudo-state in being, as something new. Well, there's nothing new about an insurgent movement proclaiming its political control over liberated territory, and also there's nothing new about insurgent movements employing conventional forces. Mao's theories of insurgency forecast that the final and decisive phase of a revolutionary war would be the formation of an insurgent army, which would be the decisive agent in defeating the government army. And this was demonstrated in practice by Ho Chi Minh's forces at Dien Bien Phu. And like the subsequent war in Vietnam that the US became involved in, ISIS shows the potential value of an insurgent force being able to conduct different types of war using different methods simultaneously in the same theatre. The wars also confirm the proposition made by UK General Sir Rupert Smith in his 2005 book, The Utility of Force, that war would tend to be amongst the people. And the war is also intertwined with a battle for the narrative, be it ISIS's sophisticated modern propaganda effort, coalition information operations, the unexpected Iranian effort to publicly promote the efforts of General Qasem Soleimani, who spent most of his life hiding in the shadows, and also the very clear information operations dimension, Russia, the separatists, Ukrainian government, that we see with Ukraine. And this continues the trend that was discernible in Iraq and Afghanistan, that the increasing proliferation and diversification and velocity of modern media make them an important part of the environment of modern military operations. And this will probably increasingly apply more widely to operations conducted by conventional state military forces. Indeed, my view is it is now as important to manoeuvre in the modern information environment as conventionally on the ground, sea or air. And in some cases, achieving influence may be equally important and objective as destroying enemies or securing terrains. And in some cases, it may be more important. And this appears to be a factor right now influencing some of the actions of both ISIS and Iran. So operations conducted across the spectrum will increasingly feature propaganda of the deed, achieving an influence or information effect as their primary purpose. And finally, a small amount about military capability. Well, if ever you wanted proof that corruption and nepotism eat military capability, both wars have it in spades. Both wars reinforce the value of competent and credible military leadership and stand, for example, the leadership of ISIS, the military leadership of ISIS, stands in stark contrast to the inferior command skills displayed by many of the political cronies of former Prime Minister Maliki. The wars both show how leadership can act as a multiplying factor to military effectiveness, albeit one that can have a plus sign or a minus sign in front of it. And both wars remind us of the value of operational level leadership and command of campaign, and of a combined arms approach to tactics where the action of infantry, artillery and sappers are sequenced and integrated to produce a whole that's greater than the sum of the parts. And we've seen this being demonstrated by both the Ukrainian separatists and ISIS. I think it illustrates the value of special forces, just as has been amply demonstrated in Iraq and Afghanistan, and also the potential value you get when special forces operations are integrated fully with conventional forces operations. So far, lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan. But there is a different model of special forces, and that's the Iranian Republican Guard Quds Force, a secretive special operations and intelligence agency. Now, the thing about Quds Force, we all know it's actively supported the special groups of Shia militias that were fighting UK and US forces in the previous decade, albeit operating covertly. But its unexpected coming out of the shadows in both Kurdistan and Iraq has shown it doing what it does. And the thing about Quds Force is it's not just special operations forces. Quds Force also has the policy lead for Iranian government policy in Iraq, Syria and Lebanon. And it's also an intelligence agency. And it also is an unconventional warfare force. So in a sense, it's doing the interagency bit. It's doing the comprehensive approach in a single organisation. Well, I think, without air power, the anti-ISIS coalition would be in a much weaker place. I mean, that's quite clear. And we also see how much the Ukrainian government forces have been greatly handicapped by not being able to use air power anywhere near the zones controlled by the separatists. But I think what we have seen is that artillery is back. It's back on the block, and it's back with a vengeance. And this, I mean, everything from mortars through to conventional gun artillery, through to artillery rockets. And we may be seeing a reversion to historic combined arms warfare. And let me make a prediction here, which might or might not be borne out by events. But if you look, for example, at US and UK casualties in both world wars, in the US Army and Marine Corps, at any one time, 60 to 80% of the casualties came from indirect fire. During Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom, 60 to 80% of US and coalition casualties were from IEDs. I think that's historically atypical, and I suspect if the analysis is done of both wars, we will find that 60 to 80% of the combat casualties of Ukrainian government forces and of the anti-ISIS forces on the ground will have come from indirect fire. And it is notable that the Russians, and for that matter the Chinese, have not disinvested themselves of indirect fire like many Western armies. Indeed, a Russian or a Chinese ground brigade, although it's very similar to a US or NATO brigade, easily has 3 times as much indirect fire. And on that cheery note, I'll invite Sam to organise some questions.
Thank you very much, Ben. That was very interesting. So before I open it up, maybe I'll take the opportunity to follow up on something you said in your intro. Hybrid war.
Yeah.
It's been talked about a lot.
Yeah.
It's in the new U.S. military strategy that was released, I believe, 2 weeks ago or a week and a half ago. This sounds very similar in a way, if you take out the sinister elements. How do you see the relationship between the kinds of tactics that you describe and this supposedly new concept in either these contexts or more broadly?
I should say we've been doing quite a bit of work on this in the Institute, not only for its own sake, but also because we've been helping NATO, the UK government, and indeed the federal German government get their hands around this. Well, the first thing, of course, is there have been many hybrid wars in the past, many wars in which government forces have had to tackle both state and non-state threats simultaneously. Indeed, the War of Liberation that the 13 colonies began in 1776 was an excellent example of this, when advantage the decisive advantage slipped away from the British when France intervened. I think there's 2 general points we've come up with in the Institute. The first thing is that countries like the United States or NATO countries need to look at where their friends and allies are potentially vulnerable to hybrid war and take actions to help that country inoculate itself against the virus. And that obviously includes strengthening the security forces of that country, but also where there are disputes in the country that might provide a cause for discontent, trying to help the country reduce those disputes. So that's the sort of big political picture to try and prevent it. When it comes to dealing with it, I mean, I think the ISS view is, first of all, it's a whole of government issue. It's not just a military issue, and that needs energising both in the country that's on the receiving end of it and indeed the countries that are helping it. The second thing is we've got to get better at information operations, winning the battle of the narrative. And you've got to get better at doing intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, and particularly in displaying credible evidence of smoking guns. And NATO was able to display credible evidence of smoking Russian guns in the fighting of East Ukraine. The trouble was it seemed to take at least 2 weeks from the civilian satellite photograph to NATO actually portraying this. I think, though, it would be a mistake to assume that every single hybrid problem that the US and NATO and their allies might face in the future would necessarily be on the Crimea, Eastern Ukraine template, or indeed the ISIS template. So it does call for a broad-based set of military capabilities. It calls for you being able to do the whole of government approach, and it also includes being sufficiently flexible and adaptable that you can tie these things together in new and unexpected ways when hit with new and unexpected problems.
Thank you very much. So let's open it up. We have a microphone that will be taken to you, and if before you ask your question or make your comment, you could identify yourselves, I would appreciate it. Over here.
Steve Winters, independent researcher. I've seen an argument, and this sort of follows, it seems, with your description of how ISIS has taken cities using sort of conventional tactics. The only additional thing they threw in was that, particularly with all these Humvees that they've grabbed, and using those Humvees as automobile bombs, that they actually substitute for the lack of an air force on the part of ISIS. So whereas if they had an air force, the planes would be coming in and dropping bombs at that point in the tactical picture, whereas in their case they just deliver the bombs with the Humvees or whatever, and that pretty much they can follow the Leavenworth plan or whatever you refer to it as. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, 2 points. There have been insurgents in the past that have got air forces. I mean, there was a while when the Tamil Tigers were on a roll and the Sri Lankan government was on a back foot, when they had an air force that actually did a surprise Pearl Harbor style raid on the government air force. They've also used boats. They've used both suicide boats and boats that have been turned into gunboats on more than one occasion on assaults on positions that have had rivers. I wouldn't want to give you the impression, though, that this is unstoppable. I think most of the fighting has been that I've studied has been against government bases, both in Syria and Iraq. But there are a couple of occasions where government forces have stopped them dead. I mean, the US Army recently, their foreign military studies people recently produced quite a good unclassified report on ISIS tactics, all of which makes sense to me and is much more detail than I've covered. But you might recall there was a key air base in central Syria, which eventually fell to ISIS over a prolonged period. But there was one period when actually some competent government troops were there who did intelligence preparation of the battlefield. They applied the same sort of planning they would to defending a conventional position against a conventional assault, including identifying likely avenues of approach, laying landmines and covering them with observation fire. And they stopped a major ISIS assault dead. You know, so vindication, if you like, of classic principles of combined armed defence as taught by Fort Leavenworth. I mean, the other thing we've seen is this threat from the armoured vehicles and the improvised armoured vehicles, particularly the ones acting as assault breakers. That's why the US government has clearly rushed out a couple of thousand AT-4 handheld rockets. And there is at least one credible report I picked up recently of a proper layered anti-armour defence of some Iraqi government position using both Cornet rockets, Cornet missiles at range, and AT-4s, actually stopping an ISIS assault. What I think you would see, though, is if, for example, in Iraq, the Iraqi government forces then fielded a layered anti-armour defence, I think what you then see is ISIS reacting in some other way. For example, increasing the length of time they spend with the artillery and direct fire bombardment, or more use of dismounted infantry. That's what I do in their position.
Over here in the front.
I'm Harlan Ullman. Ben, thanks for a very competent presentation. The Russians maintain an advantage specifically over NATO in terms of Spetsnaz propaganda, cyber, and theater nuclear weapons. Could you focus for a minute on what the West needs to do vis-a-vis the theater nuclear weapons, where the numerical superiority is something that at some stage the Russians might choose to try to exploit, in which we may not have done enough thinking about?
Well, as someone who lives in Europe, I'm still very grateful that there are reported to be several hundred US tactical nuclear weapons held under US custody, particularly for NATO, and which there are media reports that there's an increased level of exercising of the command and control machinery. NATO's been quite reticent about this. One would hope that ever since Crimea, NATO's nuclear planning group has been doing what it's supposed to do, and meeting and coming up with nuclear plans. The trouble is, of course, that within Europe there is still a great deal of almost sort of cultural doubt amongst European populations about the basing of nuclear weapons and any nuclear escalatory measures. You know, it's the late 1970s, early 80s, revisited. Now, there's been a debate on this in the pages of Survival, our academic journal, and we can sort of point that to you, people here, if they're interested in it, as they leave. And I think the arguments about doing more than reactivating the command of control and quietly making it known. I mean, many experts on this believe the waving of the nuclear as part of the rhetoric is actually reflecting Russia's perception of conventional inferiority, and also it is intended to reinforce their cognitive dissonance. I think, though, we do have to be slightly capable about mixing up discussion of theatre nuclear weapons with Russian strategic nuclear weapons, because Russia, like the United States, the UK and France, you know, has every right to modernise its national strategic nuclear deterrent, and it would be surprising if they didn't. And I think the other calculation that if there is a Russian, well, I'm sure there is in the General Staff, an equivalent of NATO's nuclear planning group, the other thing that greatly complicates their calculation is the independent deterrence of the UK and France and their demonstrable capability and the potential utility of some of them, some elements of them, at the sub-strategic level, given their accuracy. But it's not an easy issue. But Harlan, I'd be very surprised if actually within NATO, the nuclear planning group, of which of course the US, UK and France are the key members, have been working hard on this for at least a year.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Ben. Two questions. I'd like to know what you consider ISIL's main vulnerabilities from a military standpoint. And also, with regard to Russia and the Baltics, what do you think is a likely scenario they might pursue, since many consider they would not be, they're looking to avoid tripping an Article 5 condition?
So let me just go back to the second question again.
What kind of scenario do you think is plausible for Russia to undertake in one of the Baltic states, pursuing some objectives while avoiding tripping the Article 5 of NATO that would obviously compel NATO to react?
I might get Sam to help with the second question, because I think there's an important political perspective here. I'd say ISIS has two big vulnerabilities. The first one is if there's a successful offensive operation against ISIS that is sustained for any length of time, they would have to move forces. You know, I'm sure they've got some sort of operational or strategic level reserve. And if the offensive looked like it was really threatening their position, they'd have to move the forces to help counter it. Well, this is classic air-land campaign stuff dating back to 1918. You know, when the defender has to unmask, then they're very vulnerable to interdiction. But whether them moving, you know, if they say they've got a strategic level reserve brigade equivalent, whether that being moved will look like a brigade, and whether it will be combined with moves of civilians to make it much more difficult for the coalition to attack. But at the sort of campaign level, that's a key weakness. And I think their other weakness is the potential loyalty of the Sunni population. I mean, if anything is the centre of gravity of this campaign, it's the willingness of the Sunni population in ISIS-controlled areas to actively or passively support ISIS. So anything that makes them less likely to support ISIS, is going to move the campaign forward. But of course, there are immense political difficulties with the Iraqi government and the, Iranian-sponsored Shia militia that make that very difficult. I think it also applies in the even more complicated battle space in Syria, Russia, and the Baltics. Well, Sam, do you want to cover that politically? Well, I just think of a couple of military points.
All right. So I think the first point to be made here is that we're talking about contingencies that go in contexts that are far beyond the current level of geopolitical tensions, i.e., basically a Russia-NATO war. So this is not something where Putin wakes up tomorrow and says, I really want Latvia, and then suddenly that happens. Because I think that's basically not going to happen in that kind of way. So my answer would be that we should not assume that Russia would be interested in an ambiguous operation that would give the U.S. the opportunity to respond, even if there was some navel gazing in Brussels or arguments among allies about the nature of the operation. Given the geography of the region, they have other options that would not theoretically or potentially give peer military competitors like the United States an opportunity to respond. So why necessarily would they go for something ambiguous if we were to get to that point, which I said is an unlikely contingency? I think the things we should be really worried about are much more unambiguous, given the distance between the border and the Baltic Sea.
I agree with Sam. Russia is also engaged in a diplomatic and economic offensive in Europe, again, where it's embracing key members of NATO and the EU, both politically and financially. Although, Russia could not afford, for example, to bail out Greece or Cyprus. It's simply beyond it economically. But it certainly would complicate the discussions in the EU Council or the NATO, or the North Atlantic Council, in some future hypothetical crisis. I think, as Sam says, a repeat of the Ukraine playbook or a direct attack on the Baltics is extremely unlikely. But you could see a sequence of events born out of miscalculation. They may collectively be unlikely, but I think that that could happen. What we have been looking at in the Institute, though, is some of the military implications of NATO's Readiness Action Plan, which was announced last September. And we have seen, this almost continuous program of exercises, stepped up air policing in the Baltic. And that's both land and maritime exercises, and it includes the southern flank, Romania and Bulgaria. And we've also seen the US deciding it's going to pre-position a certain amount of armoured brigade combat team equipment in Eastern Europe. What has been less reported on is the NATO force integration units, the NFIUs, which NATO's been open about this. They are small teams of NATO officers designed to better integrate both training in the countries and indeed reinforcing forces. And there's 6 of them in the 3 Baltic states, Poland, Romania and Bulgaria. Now, this is not a tearing up of the founding act, but it is a small tear in the corner, because these are not really NATO boots on the ground. They're more soft shoes in an office, but they are going to be NATO teams there. Our view in the Institute's Defence and Military Analysis Programme, though, is that reinforcing forces going to the Baltics do pose some uncomfortable questions. They actually have to be sufficiently combat capable to have a deterrent effect on the calculations of Russia. A brigade or a maritime task force sent to the Baltics needs to be sufficiently capable against the Russian military for the chief of plans in the theatre military planning cell to sit up and take notice, of them to take up notice in the planning bunker in the general staff. And that, for example, requires maritime and air forces that are able to operate in contested battle space. It requires land forces that can operate against lots of armour and forces that have lots of heavy artillery and know how to use it, and all in a contested air and electromagnetic and cyber environment. And although, you know, the US forces have that, you could argue that, say, the British and French have it, and some of the German forces have it. This is an environment in which those comfortable assumptions of life from a fob, of control of the electromagnetic spectrum, of control of your own cyber capability, you know, those assumptions from campaigning in Iraq and Afghanistan don't necessarily apply. We're looking at full spectrum, expeditionary, combat capable forces, you know, against a near peer competitor that in some cases, has a considerable volume of capability, and people who at the high level know how to use it.
In the back.
This is Paul Hughes from the U.S. Institute of Peace. That's an insightful answer that you just gave, but it begs the question then about what is NATO and what are the members going to do when it comes to trying to actualize what you have just said. We have the continuing issue of burden sharing. We have economic crises in Europe, you know, and so my question is, it's great to say this, what should NATO do about it?
Well, the good news is that quite a few NATO countries have bought into the exercise programme and have also stepped up to the plate to provide the improved elements of the NATO reaction forces. You know, the Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, the so-called Spearhead Force, which is actually basically a ready brigade at high readiness. The Germans, the Norwegians and the Dutch stepped up to the plate for an interim capability. The Spanish have stepped up to lead the next one. The Brits after that, and the Brits have underwritten at least 1,000 troop composition in it right out to 2020. So that's all good. I mean, the other good thing I'd say is that about 10 of NATO's 28 members have increased defence spending. Not as much as the advocates of universal adoption of the 2% target would like, but still significant. You know, Germany not only has increased defence spending, but it's bought back 1,000 Leopard 2 tanks and is forming a new Panzer battalion. Now, many of these countries are the obvious ones, you know, the ones that share a common border, but that's a positive trend that also makes their forces more usable anyway. What you do have, though, I think, in Europe is you have a divide of view about the clear and present danger, the most pressing security challenge. Quite clearly, those countries that are worried about what's happening in the East, Russia, Ukraine, see that as the prime security challenge. But I'm afraid in Southern Europe, I suspect if we got the national security advisors of Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece, and also EU countries like Malta and Cyprus, they'd say the pressing security challenge is human migration. And there are many strategic trends in the world, including climate change, increased fragility, and also the destabilising effect of the Arab Spring, the way that's percolated south through the Sahel. You know, it suggests this is only going to get worse before it gets better. And of course, those countries on NATO's southern flank are those also who are challenged in terms of defence spending, and many of those I've mentioned still have, you know, quite considerable fiscal challenges of their own. And, you know, we can't wish that away I'm afraid. And from the point of view of US policymakers, we mustn't forget that it's inconvenient that, in a sense, the pivot towards the Asia Pacific has to a certain extent been diverted, both by Afghanistan being less stable than people might have envisaged, but also the eruption of ISIS. So I think there are some really hard security judgments that both European states are going to have to make, and indeed, the United States as the world's remaining superpower. There's no shortage of hard choices, I'm afraid.
Wait for the mic over here.
Brigadier, thank you very much. Bill Taylor from the Institute of Peace as well. You studied both ISIS and Mr. Putin and the Russian threat. Which is the greater strategic threat to international peace?
It's a question that actually,
softball,
yeah,
Bill.
it's a question actually we're regularly asked, particularly when in London we launch our major publications like the Strategic Survey, the Military Balance, and the Armed Conflict Survey. What is the threat to international peace and security that is likely to result in the violent deaths of US servicemen and US civilians, or European servicemen and European civilians? I think it has to be ISIS. Because although my personal belief is that Mr. Putin and his cronies view the US and NATO with a mixture of contempt but also fear for the raw military power and the power of the nuclear deterrent, I think the way the world is and the way ISIS has spread its tentacles from the western provinces of Canada through to Indonesia, this is global impact. And the brand and the message that if you can't make your way to the caliphate, well, do what you can to advance the aims of caliphate by some terrorism or killing some infidels. That is of such appeal to disenfranchised people, disenfranchised teenagers, for example, and it's being put across the global information environment with such sophistication that I feel is the most likely source of violent death of servicemen and civilian of the United States and its allies and friends. I wish I could be more optimistic, but...
I'll take a couple more, I guess. Why don't we group these two over here and then...
Ahmed Ali, Brandeis University. Actually, my question related to ISIS. Do you think is the situation now in the Middle East is connected to each other with the power struggle between Iran and Saudi Arabia is supporting ISIS in Iraq so far? It's through this power struggle is destroying the region as well. The Syrian conflict is well connected to Iraq and now connected to the Russian situation as well. The Russians supporting the Bashar regime as well as supporting the Iraqi government at the same time. What do you think if the US need to make some sort of new coalition or new deal for peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia, or new deal? First, the new deal with Iran. Second deal will be between Iran and Saudi Arabia, because the region is now fighting one big enemy is ISIS, and we need support from Saudi Arabia as well as from Iran at the same time.
Last one. Could hold the
Yeah, sure.
answer on that one. You got him? Okay.
Thank you. I'm from Russian News Agency. I'd like to go back to Ukraine. Just a few questions. How do you assess Russian participation in eastern Ukraine? I mean, is it mostly direct invasion, direct aggression by Russian troops, or it is just supply and support of separatists? And so how many soldiers, Russian soldiers, do you think are still on the ground in eastern Ukraine? Thank you.
I'll start with that one first. I think when the eastern Ukraine insurgency began, the people I saw on television looked as if many of them were former members of the Berkut riot police, which of course, after the change of government in Kiev, had all been immediately dismissed. And a lot of the people who were on the steps of the public buildings were wearing body armor and elements of paramilitary riot police equipment. And of course, there are plenty of people in eastern Ukraine with previous military training. I think, though, what we've seen over the last year is pretty good evidence of various levels of overt Russian support to the separatists. For example, it was one of our analysts in the Institute one lunchtime who on a relatively recent YouTube video spotted a particular variant of the T-72 tank in the separatist area, a variant that Ukrainian government forces had never had and that had never been manufactured in Ukrainian factories. I do accept what the Russian government says, that some of those who have fought in eastern Ukraine with the separatist forces are volunteers. I mean, I think there's good evidence of that. But there is also, I think, good evidence of individuals being seen in eastern Ukraine advising and assisting the separatist forces. And I accept an assessment that's been made by a number of Western governments and indeed of think tanks here in Washington, D.C., that the number of Russian troops seems to have varied from a few thousand to maybe five times that amount, and it has flexed. Because don't forget that Russia can very quickly apply resources into eastern Ukraine from across the border. I mean, I think though there's a strategic factor we need to think about, is the two people's republics, they are fronted up by people, there are a lot of people in the governments of those two people's republics who genuinely come from eastern Ukraine, and they have their own aims and own agendas. And indeed, this is a constant historic phenomenon in conflicts of this kind, that actors, act to defend their own interests. And that may be a factor in the conflict that's currently simmering away, a desire of those in the People's Republic to peg out economic gains and also a more defensible territory. Your question. I mean, General Austin, I think, is on record as saying, I've done some pretty complicated things in my time, but commanding CENTCOM and leading, the military aspects of the anti-ISIS coalition is the most demanding of all. I mean, I think a big factor here is, the various fissures and fault lines between the Shia arm of Islam and the Sunni arm of Islam, which affects a lot of it. And what you've also got in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, for example, is you've got some very wealthy individuals. And my sense also is, from our interactions in the Gulf, is various governments see things quite differently at times with regard to the degree to which the Syrian opposition can be helped. But certainly there's a sense recently from multiple media reporting that some of the non-ISIS and non-Jabhat al-Nusra, the other less extreme opposition in Syria, has benefited from what may be an informal coalition between Turkey, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and perhaps Qatar as well, and that seems to have recently had some impact on the battlefield. But in terms of the strategic aims of the anti-ISIS coalition, one, evict ISIS from Iraq, and two, destroy ISIS in Syria, the more collaboration there is between the enemies of ISIS, the better. And you could see a potential strategic shift between the US and Iran if the nuclear deal goes down, if it's actually signed and delivered. Though, of course, it's been made abundantly clear that such a signature would worry Saudi Arabia and many of the Gulf states. But we live in we have to accept we live in a complicated world, and achieving both those strategic objectives, I think, is going to be extraordinarily challenging. And actually, we should take our hats off to the people in the Pentagon, CENTCOM, out there in various places in Iraq, but also the other nation states who've signed up for this and have participated. This is all really challenging stuff, I think, that's really testing the political military leadership of all the countries involved.
Well, on that note, please join me in thanking Ben for his insights today. Thank you all for coming.